Just wait for, there we go. Okay, so it is being recorded, and we're going to start with our first presentation, which is from Josie.
Hello, everyone. Good evening from Australia. Let me start sharing. Can you see?
Yes, we can see.
Good. So, just a second. So, good evening, everyone. Today I will talk about the multidimensionality of student experience in the Australian higher education. It's a comparison between domestic and international students. So Australia has built a global reputation for offering first-class education and study experience. And it was in pre-COVID year in 2019, the second most popular destination for students choosing to study overseas, just behind the United States. In 2019, international education was the fourth largest export industry, contributing for more than $40 billion, with 70% being a higher education. Just gaining money from China and India. So higher education internationalization result in cultural diversification of the students' population and improvement of institutions' reputation and engagement in international research and collaboration. So, given the importance of international students to Australian higher education and the economy, it's crucial to better understand international student experience in the higher education sector. So, in this graph, for example, shows a trend over time in the number of domestic and international students enrolled in Australian university from 2001 to 2021. As we can see, the number of international students has significantly increased from around 157,000 in 2001 to 441,000 in 2019. However, the COVID-19 pandemic affected the scenario of ongoing growth in the number of international students enrolled at the Australian universities. So the largest figures show that the number of international students enrolled in Australian higher education has declined by around 70% in 2020 and 50% in 2021 compared to 2019. Therefore, the aim of this research is to deepen the understanding of international student experience with Australian higher education, the overall education experience, and the way this has been impacted by COVID. The research objectives are to investigate the factors that affect international student experience in Australian higher education in comparison with domestic students before the COVID pandemic. Also, analyze the difference between international students from different countries, and analyze the relationship between various aspects of student experience and overall educational experience. But how to define student experience? So, although student experience is a term commonly used, definitions remain vague. From a focus on teaching and learning, the concept of student experience has evolved to include the students' engagement with administrative and support services provided by the higher education institution. Therefore, modern concepts of student experience must go much beyond conventional focus on curriculum, evaluation, and pedagogy to include student extracurricular activities and how institutions support students manage the external commitments. Student experience is therefore a multidimensional concept influenced by various factors during the student life course. These factors include student factors such as gender, field of study, study level and stage of study, type of attendance, English speaking background students, and ethnicity. Also, institutional aspects relate to institutional structures, policies, teaching, learning, enrollment procedures, and on-campus experience. Also, social aspects, social factors that include student engagement, sense of belonging, and interaction with other students and staff. Sectoral factors that students combine study with paid work, higher education sector globalization and internationalization, and diversification of student demand. And the last one, external factors that include political, economic, and technology themes, visa and immigration restrictions, and more recently, the COVID-19 crisis. So the data set used in this study is the Student Experience Survey from the Quality Indicators for Learning and Teaching, which is the largest survey of Australian higher education students. This survey includes 5 focus areas, for example, teaching quality, learning resource, student support, skills development, and learning engagement, and also overall educational experience. So in this study, we use control variables such as gender, age, course level, and the analytical sample is around 200-800. The analytic approach for this study is comparing the student experience of domestic and international students, and also the relationship between the various aspects of student experience and overall educational experience. So let's talk about the results. So comparing the student experience of domestic and international students, we found that being an international student is the main factor that negatively impacts student overall education experience. International student is positively associated with experience, with skills development, learning resource, student support, and teaching quality, and negatively associated with learning engagement. The patterns for international students and no English-speaking background are comparable. Although not the main focus of these students, this model with the model coefficients of the control variables provide interesting insights into the key student factors that affect the student experience. So the difference in experience between international students from different regions. We found that the international students from Oceania Sub-Saharan Africa and Southern and Central Asia tended to have a better overall educational experience and better experience in all 5 focus areas. Also, international students from other regions tend to have an inferior overall educational experience than domestic students, with students from Northeast Asia reporting the worst experience. So, the relationship between various aspects of student experience and overall educational experience. So we use the interaction term that shows that international student moderates the effect of each of the aspects of student experience on the overall educational experience. The effect of learning engagement and learning resource on overall educational experience are stronger among international students than among domestic students. In general, it's steeper for international students than domestic. For the effect of skills development, student support, and teaching quality on the overall education experience are weaker among the international students than domestic students. The conclusions. We found that student experience is affected by several factors, but being international student is the main factor negatively impact the student overall educational experience. International student experience differ depending on student region of origin. And also, being an international student moderates the effect of each aspect of a student experience on overall education experience. The effects of learning engagement and learning resource are stronger among the international students than among domestic students. And the effects of teaching quality, student service, and skills development on overall education experience are weaker among the international students than among domestic students. So, the implications for the theory, policy, and praxis is added to literature by testing the separate and interconnected roles of various factors influencing student experience. Also contributes to a better understanding of how international and domestic higher education students differ in terms of educational experience. Improve the quality and effectiveness of higher education policies on each of 5 focus areas. And finally, the flow-on effects of helping higher education institutions and the Australian government to implement changes to maintain international enrollments and potentially attract more students. The future work. So my future work is looking at investigate how international student experience was impacted by COVID-19 and also explore the life experience of students during the COVID-19 pandemic and discern the changes that have been occurred in comparison to the pre-COVID-19 era. So I would like to acknowledge the Australian government and the University of Queensland, and also Life Course Center for support and funding my project, my supervisors, and the conference committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Josie. Well done. Do you want to
Thank you.
stop sharing and then we can
Yes.
see if there are any questions? I've got a few myself, but I can see there's a hand up already. So Nadia, do you want to go first?
Hi. It was actually a hand clapping.
Oh,
Charlotte,
sorry.
presentation, Kelsey. Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. I think there is a hand up from Joanna. Is that correct?
Yes,
excellent.
correct. Thank you. Josie, thanks for the fascinating presentation. It was very organized. So I have two questions, being a student mobility scholar myself. So first of all, thanks for comparing international and local students, because I think that usually we tend to characterize the experience of international and local students as two separate experiences and sometimes offering different theoretical frameworks. So it was quite interesting to see that. Then I'd like to ask you, so at one point you broke down the different aspects of the multidimensionality of the student experience. Are all these factors based on your empirical data?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, very
It's
good.
all empirical data. And then because we try to include as many factors to analyze. So that's why when we use all the control variables is to have a more sense and analyze in a broader way.
Yeah, and hopefully you will extract a paper out of it, because I think it's a very interesting
Yes,
framework.
soon.
Okay, so I won't take more time. I see that there are other colleagues with their hands up. Thank you.
I'll thank for the question.
Right, I'm just going to jump in with my own because I think it leads on from Joanna's, which is so you used a national survey, as I understand it. This is a survey that's used in Australia. So from the UK, we have something similar, but we have different terminology in different sections. So I wondered if you could just say a little bit about the survey itself in terms of those different groupings, and particularly. I'm interested in whether there was any qualitative data that students provide and whether you plan to analyse that. And secondly, you said that learner engagement was one of the most negatively impacted areas. What does learner engagement comprise from this survey?
Thanks for the question. Let me start this because this study is a huge study, and then we divide it in 3 parts. So we decided to use this Australian survey because is a national survey and includes huge numbers of students, and we have this is very consistent, this data set used here in Australia. So to analyze before COVID and also during COVID, I use this data set, but also we found that we need some qualitative part in the research. And then for my third part of the studies is going to be qualitative, that we already interview 11 international students and 5 domestic students. So then we can have a general idea, and I think the qualitative part is going to, I can say, complement, because I think for these studies it's good to have both the quantitative. For this kind of study, I think it's important to have the quantitative and qualitative. So now for the second question is about what learning engagement includes. Is more what include. I don't have time to show, but I have a slide that show what includes. But is more in engagement between students, even between domestic students, interaction with staff, is more this social aspect that includes in student engagement. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that does, and that makes sense from your data. Thank you. Diana?
Deanna, hello, hi.
Diana.
Thanks ever so much, Josie. That was really, really interesting. Could you say, I was really happy to see you commenting on the implementation of policy into practice, and I'm interested in the more local level changes that might be possible at institutional level, that, you know, arising from the data that you've seen, because you talk a lot about obviously affecting national policy and changes on that, but could you comment a bit more on possible localized changes at a local level, particularly in, for example, your own institution?
When we did this research, we just start to think about how we can implement things for international students, because we have huge number of international students, they come to Australia. And what we can do better for students to still come into Australia, how we can increase the numbers, and also what we can do for them to have a good time in Australia and for the academic, not only academic, but is a student life. So what we can improve for them to have a good experience in Australia and at university.
Yeah.
So that was the main focus of my studies. We need to see what else we can do to improve. That's what I'm looking at the moment.
Okay, and just as a follow-up, was there anything about the academic experience that came out, or was it really primarily on that student life side of things?
We're looking about all areas, academic and all engagement, everything. So that's why we try to take every single of 5 aspects,
Yeah,
and then we can, exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that's why we decided to analyze these 5 areas instead only academic or only teaching.
Right.
Then we decided to include these 5 areas.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you.
I've got another question if nobody else has got one right now. I was really interested in the graphs that you shared, and I see they're in your abstract as well, that there were some areas where actually if students came from a particular region, then their experience was actually more positive than domestic students. And that to me seemed like quite a key finding. And I wondered whether that was surprising, unexpected, and whether you have any insight from your data as to why that might be.
Well, great question. So when we decide to analyze students from different areas, is most because I have been working with international students for more than 8 years. And when we start to work with them, we can see the difference between students when they talk with you. We can see the way they talk with you, what their needs are different. So that's why I was interested to analyze every single different regions. So I can tell you, some regions was a little bit surprised, and others I was expecting these results.
Okay, and did you have any insights into why there were difference, or is that what your qualitative phase is going to look into?
This is my qualitative that I want to show, because I have some ideas, but I think it's better to just use the qual part just to show, with, especially because I have different participants from different nationalities, and it'd be great to show this difference in my 3rd study.
Just pause a moment to see if there's any other questions from the group. We've got a couple more minutes on this one. I guess I'm also interested in whether there's been a similar analysis like this of this national survey before. Has anyone analysed this data from an international student experience perspective before in different years?
Yeah, I saw some studies, but they use sometimes only one aspect of one aspect. And other studies, I saw some study in UK that use quite a similar data set. So I was trying to, because before I was thinking to maybe to compare, but then I decided to focus more in Australia and then include more factors, more aspects to be more stronger research.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. I hope you found that useful, Josie. I really loved your slides. I thought they were really clear and really got across the key messages. So thank you very much for your presentation and your responses to the questions. I'm going to invite Sarah to start to prepare her slides. Actually, just before we do that, if we could just again give Josie a round of applause, either with our hands or
Thanks, Charlotte.
well done. And then Sarah, do you want to prepare your slides?
Yes, I am all set with those, Charlotte. I can't actually start my video though. It says the host won't let me. There we go.
Sorry, that was me.
No, it's all okay. All right, are you okay for me to start sharing my screen and start with the presentation?
Yes, we're meant to start at 1:15, just in case there are any individuals coming from another session, but by all means, do you want to bring your slides up so that we're ready to go?
Sure.
I think will be good to start if you want to do start with a slightly longer introduction of yourself, perhaps.
Sure. So my name is Sarah. My presentation is More Than Food and Fun. It's a systematic review of higher education orientation programs. So I'm going to talk about my systematic review that I've been doing, where it's up to, and kind of look at how it links back to some of my larger research that I'm undertaking. I might just real quick, well, before getting into kind of the rest of the presentation, take a moment to acknowledge that I am presenting to you all from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. The lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people are located in Canberra, Australia, and so it's also a brilliant excuse for me to be able to share this lovely photo of my university campus. Feel incredibly privileged that the space that I'm in, which is actually at that the bottom set of buildings there. It's actually a place where education has occurred for thousands of years. So I feel very privileged to be a part of that continued tradition of teaching and learning within this space. I thought I'd start with a bit of context setting for everyone. So to start with, when I'm talking about transition, I'm referring to a person's roles, relationships, routines, and assumptions. And when I'm talking about orientation, I'm referring to the program or activities run to support the transition process. And have this handy model that I've created to kind of help talk through why this is so important. On the left-hand side, you have the individual before they come into a higher education institution. The transition process happens regardless of whether the institution actually has any interventions in place, any orientation programs. And this transition process actually impacts on the individual's academic and social engagement experience throughout their time at university, which ultimately impacts on them as an individual, their grades, and their outcomes at the end. And this is important because, the fact that it does have that impact regardless of whether we do anything. And what we know from research is that if we do things and this transition period is successful, it really has a lasting impact on students. And so it impacts on their retention and their likelihood of successfully completing their degrees, on their engagement with peers, academics, and staff, and on their well-being. So it is particularly important period of time to be able to be supporting students effectively. So all of this came about, this systematic review, because a number of years ago, so I've been practicing as a professional staff member at the university for over 13 years. And about 4 years ago, we implemented a new transition program and wanted to understand what the impact actually was. It's a program for students from traditionally underrepresented backgrounds, so especially important to make sure that what we were putting in place was actually doing what we thought it was going to do. And so from this, I kind of, started to look at best practice and what was available, started to ask some questions when I wasn't finding what I assumed I would find. And eventually that led to me undertaking or commencing a PhD. And so with this PhD, the overall question that I'm looking at is, to what extent do orientation and transition programs impact on the sense of belonging, well-being, and academic outcomes of undergraduate domestic school leavers in comparable cohorts? Which is always such a mouthful to say. But, this question really led to the first, most obvious question, kind of that continuation of, what have other people already found? And what does the research say about this? Now, what I've done is I've actually undertaken this as a systematic review. It's something that has become more prominent in higher education research over the past 10 years. Normally, it's traditionally found within medical or scientific research. And essentially, the process is similar to with a literature review. You determine your criteria, you select your databases that you're going to use and your search query. You conduct a search where you are going through databases and literally scraping out as much information as you can find, all the different papers and documents that are available. Then you refine those results with a team of reviewers. So it's not just you, it's a number of people who are going through that to make sure that you're refining it to have as much of the available data sets and documents as possible. And the reason that I have gone through a systematic review instead of a literature review, partly because it ensures that you have covered just about everything that you can, and I really want to make sure I include as much as possible. The other part is that my institution, ANU, doesn't actually teach education. And because ANU doesn't teach education, ANU doesn't study education. So the closest thing is actually within the medical education unit, in the medical school, essentially. A slightly odd place to be researching higher education, but luckily my interest actually began with the sense of belonging and the social identity process. And this is grounded in psychology. So it makes it, kind of fit together nicely in a slightly mishmash sort of way. And one of the other reasons that starting with the systematic review method is that the data on orientation in higher education, it's already there, and it just really needed to be brought together. It was one of my first assumptions that, oh yes, I'll be able to find somebody who's done this already and read what they've said, to realize that no, it hadn't, and I might need to be pulling some of this together myself. So in terms of my specific systematic review, looking at the eligibility criteria that I utilized, obviously looking at orientation and transition programs, I was looking for quantitative research, and this was trying to move from the kind of perspective and perceived benefits to those that could be really efficiently reported on. And when looking at the available research, qualitative papers were most often about the satisfaction of the programs as opposed to tangible impacts. And particularly when it comes to on the professional side, we need to have a lot of that quantitative information for government reporting and institutional reporting and everything like that. One of the other criteria was that it was based in the US, UK, or Australia. The alignment between the UK and Australian models of institutions, they're very similar. Australia is based off the UK model, and then the US, because that is where most of the research occurs in this space. And then again, focused on undergraduate students, linked back to my overall research question. The databases that I used were ERIC, PsycInfo, Scopus, JSTOR, ProQuest, and Google Scholar. And I used a variety of search queries, and it couldn't actually come. Normally with a systematic review, you try to have one standard string that you can plug into all the different databases. But due to the way the different databases were set up, that wasn't actually possible. So instead I had to use different variations along the way. But these were the words that were included in all of the different search queries. So on the right-hand side, you can see a Prisma diagram of how this all broke down in terms of what, starting with over 2,000 papers and then slowly screening those, thankfully with a team of others, and getting through to 139 papers. So I've read through those 139 papers, and from all that came to the conclusion that participation in orientation and transition programs has a statistically significant positive impact on retention, GPA, academic progress, and well-being. Great thing to know, because this is an academic conference. I'll share my citations for that statement. There are 85 of them. Now, while the practitioner in me is very pleased with being able to have a concrete statement that I can use now when there are questions about the validity and importance of orientation programs, it's obviously not enough in terms of trying to understand what's happening in this space, and really kind of getting into the nitty-gritty details of it. And part of the challenge came up from the fact that a lot of these papers weren't actually looking at university-wide standalone programs. Because so much of it was US-based, they were actually looking at programs that are run in addition to orientation. So the students who are being evaluated and being, looking at the impact and outcomes for these students, they're actually doubly oriented. And this is particularly important for, the fact that orientation is mandatory in the US, and within the UK and Australia, it's not. So for us, we really need to have that understanding about the impact of the standalone programs as opposed to those add-on programs. We need to have that baseline understanding first. So I narrowed the focus to look at just the standalone programs, and because it took so long to even get here, did an additional search for more papers. And there are a couple of key questions that I'm looking at. The first being, what is it that we're trying to achieve, and how varied is it across the available evidence base? The stated purpose of orientation programs varies, and researchers suggest that orientation is an ongoing process similar to transition. So if that's the case, what specifically is the purpose and the focus for the initial orientation programs? The next question is, which elements are included in impactful orientation programs? So related back to that purpose and intention, with limited resources, it means we really need to understand what is actually going to make a difference so that we can invest our time and energy into making sure those things are included as part of orientation. And then finally, what outcomes are being measured, how and when? So tied into all of that, what is actually being measured and used to evaluate the impact of the programs? So with a kind of a brief overview of where I ended up after that narrowed focus, ended up with 93 papers, much more manageable than 139. Of those, 6 were academic papers, 18 were theses, thesi, and so then the other thing that was really interesting, somehow not surprising though, is that where those actually came from. None of them came from within Australia. 2 came from the UK, and the remaining 21 from the US. This actually isn't surprising when you look at the professionalization of the higher education sector within the US. So in the US, you actually need to have a master's degree in higher education or a PhD to be able to be working in a university. So that just means that there is actually so much more research being undertaken as all these people are moving up to move into different levels and different roles within an institution. What I'm going to focus on is some of the things that kind of really jumped out at me and I found very interesting, and hopefully you all do as well. So the first is when I was looking at the purpose of the orientation, we had 13 of the documents that had explicit statements about what the program was intending to do, 3 that had kind of intended outlines but spread across multiple paragraphs, 7 where it was really vague intent, things like increased retention, smooth transition. So across all of those, though, we coded those and came up with 3 different categories or 3 different themes to kind of use to help describe the purpose of these programs. And that was building student connections, building student knowledge and skills, and facilitating longer term outcomes. And you can see, obviously, that makes more than the 23 papers that I was looking at. And that's because most often what was being included was the outcome plus how that was going to be achieved. And when we're looking at the longer term outcomes, it really came down to quite often either the academic success that was being considered or integration. And I found this particularly interesting. I mean, the academic success made sense. You know, the overall goal of university is to make sure students are successfully supported to be able to complete their degree, to have the knowledge to be able to go on into a career in the field that they have chosen. That one makes a lot of sense. Integration, I found particularly interesting because most people in this space have moved from talking about integration and actually talking about inclusion and sense of belonging within an institution. But when looking at the different statements that were used as when talking about the purpose, it was actually talking quite often about integration. So statements like assisting them in their assimilation to the college classroom, acculturate to the settings, services, and facilities of campus life, seamless integration, initiate the integration of newly admitted students into the academic, cultural, and social climate of the university. So I found this really kind of, very, very interesting. But it very much made me think of, Tinto's work on student departure theory and the model of institutional departure. You can clearly see where the consideration of academic and social integration is laid out in here. And, this integration that's being considered in the model is really where sense of belonging and the social identity processes occur. And so I started to look to see what sort of elements were being included in the programs which aim for this integration. Is it actually, trying to get people to change who they are? Or is it, what we use now to talk about, kind of that community building and that sense of belonging that was trying to be created? So I looked at the different elements that were included in the orientation programs that either looked at academic success or integration. So there were only 14 that I looked at because 3 of them actually included both academic success and integration. 3 of them didn't actually include information on what the program included as part of their research. And so looking at this, I just, done a heat map here to try and make it kind of really easy to see where it is that most of the papers focused or most of the programs had their key elements. Makes a lot of sense in terms of academic success. You're focusing very much on that academic engagement, the engagement with academic staff, some also with the services and later year students. And then on the other side, with integration, that strong focus on, engaging with a variety of different people from peers, academic staff, but also later year students and professional staff. And then that sense of belonging and identification. So being part of the community. So makes sense. All came together and kind of seemed to be going the way that I expected it to. But then we got to looking at the outcomes and what's being measured. And quite interestingly, when you're looking at what's being measured across these, the integration is actually still measuring academic outcomes. So there is very little that's being measured in terms of the engagement. There's some, but not very much in terms of the engagement that's going on, in terms of the well-being, which includes a sense of belonging and social identity. So there really is, even though they're saying that the intention of the program is to bring students into this community, they're not actually measuring that as one of the outcomes of the programs. So it's quite an interesting space and something that I'm not really sure why it's happening, but it links very much with a lot of the work that I've been looking at in terms of social identity theory. So with social identity theory, a lot of what's come out in terms of research into student retention and departure really indicates the importance of belonging and social connections. So as I just showed earlier with Tinto's model of institutional departure, which is linked to the theory of student departure, it's clearly articulated in there. And yes, he used integration originally, but even he has talked about that it is about that community building. It's not about needing to change to be part of the community, but being accepted by the community for who you are and being yourself within that community. And then similarly, the theory of student involvement talks about it. And even models like the general model for assessing change allude to the impact of the social identity processes without specifically saying it. So talking about the engagement and talking about the connection with community. And so that's where I'm trying to come in with my overall research, is trying to actually say it clearly and help make some of those connections and see where we can make an influence on that sense of belonging. And the reasoning for this is because, sense of belonging, it leads to having students engaging in deeper learning, or having increased academic achievement, having better well-being and mental health, or having the resources in order to overcome obstacles of poor mental health, and having greater persistence when faced with obstacles. And that's particularly important because belonging really supports the transition space and overcoming challenges that arise during the transition process. And there's evidence around that, but again, it's quite often linked to these, kind of add-on programs that are occurring. So there's still more that I'm doing in the systematic review space, especially because I got to that big statement and all those papers, and then kind of going, okay, well, that's not enough. I needed to kind of refine and narrow down. But what we do know so far is that there are some clear gaps. So the UK and Australian research is really limited, as you could see, and we need that to be able to get that understanding from the perspective of our structures, and in particular, the non-mandatory nature of our orientations. In general, whole of university orientation evaluation is limited, and this is particularly important, again, before we're adding on additional programs which are going to be influencing students in various ways. We really need to have that base level understanding about what does, if we're telling a student you come in for the day-long orientation, what is the impact of them doing that? Is that actually worth their time? Is it worth our time? Where does it make a difference? And then, the discrepancy between the aims of what programs are saying that they're going to do and the measure of what they're actually looking at and evaluating. And that's particularly for me with sense of belonging, because there are scales and there are ways to measure that in a quantitative method. But it's something that very much is not appearing in the current literature. So next, I'm starting in a couple of hours. I'll be working on meta-analysis to be looking at the retention into year 2, as the papers have indicated that there's a statistically significant impact of participating in orientation on those retentions, and seeing how that works actually across all the papers, and whether when they're brought together and considered, it is maintained. So I'm actually going to finish with a request because my time is spent with psychologists, and I would really value, this is my first academic conference that is for higher education researchers. And I would really value, suggested readings, people's time for conversation and connecting, and also everyone's openness in asking and answering questions. So I'm going to put my email address there because my last name in my email is different than my last name. But thank you all so much.
Great, thank you, Sarah. If we could, give Sarah a round of applause virtually. If you want to stop sharing your screen, then we can see who's here and if there's any questions for Sarah. I found that really, really interesting. It's a lovely step through of where you've got to so far with your project. I can see there are a couple of hands that have gone up. So if we start with Itamli, apologies if I pronounce that incorrectly.
That's why thank you, Charlotte, and thank you, Sarah. I thoroughly enjoy your presentation, and I think it's a really interesting topic because I think orientation is something that we do, but we don't actually interrogate enough. And so I'm glad that you are doing this research topic. Um, so if I remember correctly, you are focusing on domestic students. I was curious about the rationale for choosing domestic students. And because we have a lot of international students here, what would be the difference? And do you expect to see differences in orientation for domestic students and international students? And if I can have the second question, so I'm working on in the doctoral education space, so with PhD candidates, and I was wondering if you came across anything about orientation for doctoral candidates or higher degree by research students in Australia in your literature review. I know you don't have that keyword in your search, but just wondering if you came across anything and how much of your findings, your current findings, are applicable to the doctoral education space from your own experience as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. Okay, the domestic one is probably an easier one to answer first. So there were two reasons, well, probably three reasons that I narrowed it down to domestic undergrads. One is because so one of it's actually kind of funding based in terms of the orientation program that we started is one that is only for domestic students, and that's because of the funding source. It's being funded by the Australian government, and so to be able to appropriately evaluate that program, needed to be able to have that comparable cohort that is domestic school leavers, as opposed to mature age students or international students. And so then the second part is, yeah, because my supervisor keeps reminding me I need to narrow my focus. So not going beyond and trying to look at so many different cohorts. Because I think, the third reason kind of comes with this as well, that with international students and cultures, like Eastern cultures and everything like that, there's actually consideration about how sense of belonging impacts and works within those cultures, because there is such a different focus away from individualism and quite often more towards a collectivist idea. And so psychologists they kind of get a bit baffled when they're coming from the Western cultures to try and understand how sense of belonging and those social identity processes work within more collectivist cultures. So that was kind of the reasoning for it. But then, I mean, practically, the support for international students transitioning to university is probably not that different in terms of what's needed. There are just more assumptions that it's different, because there are a lot of assumptions, at least within Australia, that because these people are adults, that they are fine and that they can just come in and they'll understand. And so instead, there's more often a focus on things like first generation domestic students as opposed to general domestic students. So yeah, so it kind of, the cohorts get tricky and large. In terms of HDR, we have a lot of acronyms at ANU, even abbreviating our name. Higher degree research students. I don't recall specifically coming. I remember seeing some, but I couldn't, kind of pick out some of the papers or the names of them. But when it comes to the experiences of those HDR students and that orientation process, there is a lot of alignment. So on the professional side of my work, we spent a couple of years creating an orientation and transition framework to be applied across the board at the university, so that we can actually go, okay, these are the objectives. We might be trying to meet these objectives slightly differently, but even still, you have undergraduate students who are mature aged, who have caring responsibilities, who are working part-time. There's so many different factors across all the groups, regardless of what degree they're doing. And also when you are going into university, just because you've done a degree before doesn't mean you understand that institution. It doesn't mean you understand that degree level and the context and the expectations. And I know that for me, I've done all my degrees in different countries, and every time I'm surprised at how surprised I am. And so, you know, I think practically it is something that is really applicable and really important for those HDR students. And especially because once you get above the undergraduate level, they often get forgotten in that kind of space, and there isn't as much intentional focus given.
Thank you. I do have one question because you focus very much your analysis and your presentation on understanding what the content of these programs look like, and I wondered to what extent you'd looked at mode and whether what does the literature say about programs, orientation programs that are kind of designed around in-person activities or online activities?
Yeah, so I did look at mode a little bit. The intention was to look at institutions where their students were studying in person. And sorry, I realizing I forgot to include that in my eligibility when I shared that. But there were still a few programs where it's actually an online orientation that students would do just before arriving. There just weren't very many of them. When it came down to the standalone programs, I think there was one, I think there might have been one that actually had an online component of the orientation. And so, yeah, I haven't really looked at how that might be different compared to the in-person ones.
Great. Yeah, and from a UK perspective, I can understand why there's not that much literature. Often there is a bare induction program at a kind of university level, and then a lot of it is expected to be delivered by schools and individual academic departments. So yeah, the clear gap there.
Yeah, and also quite often for the international students, I was going to say my second degree was in the UK actually, and as an international student in the UK, I got to go through the orientation process, which was so much of that community building, which was lovely and really helpful. So
yeah, great. Okay, we'll leave it there then for Sarah's time slot. So thank you very much once again, Sarah, for sharing your research. And if we just give another clap, and then we will move on to our final presentation for the day, which is Jeju. So do you want to get your slides ready and then we will start?
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. I actually had a question for Sarah. Maybe if we had time later, we can talk about more about Sarah's work. It's just excellent. But I don't know how to raise my hand virtually, so I was just trying to.
Okay.
Yeah,
you can wave as well.
Okay, yeah.
Or post in the chat when you've got a question. That's another way.
Oh, good idea. Thank you very much. Yeah, but I try to remember it and then ask it later. Let me share my screen now. Where is it? Sorry, 1 second. Yeah, here is my slide. Okay. Great.
Okay, so it's not presenting just, there we go, perfect.
Okay, perfect. Yes, thanks. Thanks, Charlotte, for sharing this wonderful session, and also for Josie and Sarah for sharing your excellent research. I now kind of regret for not submitting my project on international students, so that we would have more common ground to talk about. But there are some like common issues in the international scholars research as well. So I hope we could have some more discussion later. So the topic I'm going to share today is precarity and privilege, exploring international early career researchers' experiences in Chinese universities. The third time, from School of Education, Shanghai Jiao Tong University. I obtained my PhD from UCL, so I used to be an international student in the UK as well. So a little bit about this research. So the global mobility of academic talents and Chinese talent introduction. So talent is kind of word in the Chinese policy document indicating the like scholars or experts coming to China for working. So the global mobility of international scholars has been more and more common in the field of higher education and globalization nowadays. And China has actively launched a series of policies and funding programs to attract global talents all over the world. So the percentage of foreign international scholars working in the China's higher education institution now currently is quite low, only accounts for like a 1.1%. But the overall number of the international scholars are quite big, around like 18,000 of them working in the Chinese universities now. So currently the gap in the research is very few attention has been paid to the group of overseas scholars in China, and recent research mainly lies in the policy implications, and only a few looking at the perspective of the individual experiences of this group. And a little bit about the international scholars in the globalized academic market. So first, institutional culture is quite important to understand their situation. For example, in China, the institutional culture is quite different from the kind of a Western, with a quotation mark, Western one, because the management style and the hierarchical mode is quite unique in China. And then the international scholars' previous international experiences is quite significant for their working experiences in the new cultural context, and also for their students, because one of my projects looking at international scholars and their Chinese students a relationship, and there are some difficulties to overcome when it comes to the different styles of communication and supervising. And the last one is the adaptation and integration. So the degree of satisfaction of the working of those groups actually depends on the situations of the institution and the level of integration with the new cultural context. So the purpose of this research is to explore the subjective experience of international scholars, in particular the early career academics in Chinese university, to understand what they have encountered and what the reactions made to the context, and to unpack the complex pathways towards the acculturation strategy, and present how they generate diverse approaches to cope with the cross-cultural challenges. And this project is actually an ongoing project. So what I'm going to present today is part of the data and also preliminary findings of my research. I conducted in-depth interviews in 2015. That is the first round of data collection long ago. And then this year, I started the second round of interview in the same university. With the first round of data collection, to see that what has changed after the 8 years. Apart from that, I collected more than 200 international scholars' profiles from the university to access their emails, and also to have to understand their traces of mobility before they come to China. And I adopt the purposive sampling method and snowballing method to get enough participants to join my project. And in total, I have 39 participants to join my project so far. But today I'm going to only present those collected in 2015, because the newest data are only collected but not analyzed yet. So the theoretical perspective I'm using to understand it is various acculturation strategy. I noticed that in Sarah's systematic review, many of the previous research talk about the integration strategy and the assimilation strategies. So in various framework, he categorized the different acculturation strategies according to the two issues. The first one is the relative preference for maintaining one's heritage, culture, and identity. The second one is the relative preference for having contact with and participating in the larger society, along with other ethno-cultural groups. So according to the degree of maintenance and degree of adaptation, he categorized the four strategies, that is the integration, assimilation, separation, and marginalization. So currently many research adopting various this strategy model is on the quantitative research, but I read through his theory again, and I discovered that there are a lot of nuanced discussions and interpretations that I can actually use to understand some qualitative data as well. So the first one, I'm going to talk about the integration strategy. So integrating into the institutional culture of the Chinese academia. So as Barry argued, a precondition for the individuals to achieve the strategy of the integration is when the dominant social cultural context is open and inclusive in regards to the cultural diversity. So therefore, the integrated strategy can only be really chosen when the mutual accommodation is achieved, which requires both the incoming groups to acquire the basic value of the place of settlement and the dominant group to be prepared to meet the needs of diverse groups living and working in a plural environment. So in other words, I interpret that if someone adopting the integration strategy, this person and the institutional culture's relationship should be equal rather than having a different like a power relationship or like a struggling power dynamics. So the participants generally reported that a dean or the leader of the department with good communication skills and overseas background and outstanding personalities can contribute to the creation of an institutional culture inclusive of international scholars. This is related to the feature of the management structure of Chinese universities. Because of this hierarchical management style, usually the dean or the leader of the department has the final say or has all the say about the issues surrounding in the department. So if this dean is willing to help or is willing to create this atmosphere friendly to the international scholar, many problems can be solved very quickly. But if it's not the case, things could be very difficult for the international scholars. Moreover, inclusive institutional culture could enable the international scholars to get involved in the existing social network and further facilitate their integration with a new environment. So on the right hand is an example from Daniel. So he's working in the natural science, and he reported that, I don't know why it's very international everywhere. I find people all like to interact with me. And also everyone has the ability to interact with him. So in this case, Daniel is actually like a fish in the water that he doesn't really need to adapt too much to the environment because this environment itself is international. But he's one of the lucky ones. For some others, it's not the case. But for the senior scholars, I find it's like it's more likely for them to adapt to the diverse Chinese institutional cultures easily. Because usually the senior international scholars have a sufficient international working experiences, and they usually could develop a high level of personal adaptability, which enables them to identify the suitable institutional culture for them and cope with a wide range of cross-cultural situations rather than relying on luck. So therefore, they would intentionally choose the type of institution that suits their requirement for inclusiveness when seeking for the job opportunity, and they actively maintain a balance between their own needs and the environment's expectations to avoid encountering conflicts or misalignments. So for the second strategy, that is the assimilation strategy, I noticed in several research, many of them kind of used assimilation and integration interchangeably, but actually in Barry's theory, this is the common dispute actually, because many people think assimilation and integration is basically the same thing. But he noted for a long time the non-dominant were encouraged to transform their ways of living from the traditional way to a way representing the value of the dominant group, in this case, the new cultural context. So when the individuals choose to shed their cultural background and become fully engaged in the dominant group, the assimilation strategy is defined. So therefore, different from the integration strategy, which emphasizes the maintenance of one's cultural heritage, the assimilation strategy indicates a high degree of compliance to the dominant culture. So on the right hand, this is the case for Kevin. So Kevin is an early career researcher working in the social science. So he reported very positively about his interactions with his dean with international background, even though his workload was no doubt the heaviest among all the participants in this research. So he was assigned a lot of tasks since he joined the department, and he felt all the things he has done for the department were rewarding to his own development. So from Kevin's case, we found that this is Kevin's first formal academic position after he obtained a PhD degree, and he had limited knowledge about what to expect from his job, and he hardly formulated a certain mode of working style. And more importantly, Kevin found it very difficult to find a permanent position in the European context. So that's the reason why he went to China to find an academic position. And also this prestigious reputation of his school he's working in, and the conformity of heavy workload and hardworking atmosphere actually encouraged within this institution. Those together lead him to a high degree of acceptance of this underlying logic of hardworking in the school, even though it remains unclear that to what extent he would give up his old way of doing things to catch up with this rapid development of the school. Kevin now is very willing to adapt himself fully to the rhythm of working in the institution and voluntarily justify for his choices, even though he is now under very huge pressure at the time of interview. So in Kevin's case, we think this kind of active adaptation is not necessarily leading to a real integration. We find it's more like assimilation, which implies in compliance to the conformity of the dominant culture and the withdrawal from the power struggle in the shared cultural context. And it's more often happen to the early career researchers because they rarely have the the power or the chance to negotiate for more space or more uniqueness for their own working load. And the last one is the marginalization mode. So marginalization and separation really refer to the two conditions of negative orientations toward building these relationships. I only find the participants fall into the marginalization strategy rather than separation, because separation means that you are distant from both the destination context and also your original context. And the two main reasons leading to the marginalization is the hierarchical management mode within the Chinese university, and also the institution's unpreparedness of accommodating the international scholars. In some cases, some participants complain that they got the feeling that they were recruited as a kind of international matrix, which means that they appear in the department just because they are international, and that is some kind of requirement in the development of internationalization of the Chinese university. And in this case, the international scholars in this situation usually find themselves living in a bubble. So when they come across some difficulties related to the administrative issues, they find it very difficult to report these issues to the dean, and usually the dean would not solve the problem for them. So this kind of failure of a bottom-up feedback and the inability to accomplish timely adaptation, leading to a significant disagreement with the institutional culture, and self-exclusion becomes the way of self-protection for them. And for one participant, he considered his self-exclusion as a privilege, because so that he could save himself from the very complex institutional politics and interpersonal relationships in the department, and focus only on the research and teaching. So some concluding remarks. We find that the early career researchers in this project are generally caught up in the nexus of precarity and privilege. Both their career status and international background act as essential roles in shaping their unique pathway in the Chinese academic milieu. And even though they have different strategies now adopted in this context, such as integration, assimilation, and marginalization, we still find that many of them are struggling between this precarious status and the sense of privilege working and living in the Chinese university. This is mainly because that first, they are cultural outsiders in this broader context, and as early career researchers, they find it really difficult to negotiate for the working condition and workload with the institution. But at the same time, as international scholar, they actually occupied a position like with the symbolic significance in the chain of the global knowledge production. So by recruiting the international scholars as the Chinese universities actually reproduce and maintain or compete in the hierarchy of the global knowledge production, so that those early career researchers with international background are actually privileged in such a working context. But at the same time, they many of them consider themselves as privileged for their conditions as the cultural and social outsider, because so that they could save them from this complex institutional and interpersonal relationships. So, but that is only some preliminary findings, and we are shifting our focus to the early career researchers in our analysis. So if any of you have some personal feelings or reflections on this topic, you're all welcome to share your comments or feedbacks on this project. And there's one thing I forgot to mention, that because our data collection lasts for the first round is like 8 years ago, I found that more and more early career researchers are now joining in Chinese universities compared with 8 years ago. I think that reflects on the global trend of this young researchers struggling experience of finding a job right now in the academic market. So yeah, those are the interesting points that I find I want to share with you from my project, and looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Thank you. If you just want, we'll just give you a round of applause. So thank you very much for sharing your research with us. It was really, really interesting. Please do let me know if you've got a question. Pop your hand up or post it in the chat. I did have one question to begin with, or maybe an observation based on, I think, your last statement, actually, in terms of the position for early career researchers more generally. And I wonder to what extent your data already gives you insight into the motivations for international early career researchers or staff going to work in China.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, that's a very important factor in understanding their working experiences in China. And thanks for bringing up this question, actually. And we got another paper working on the motivation itself, and we find it very interesting that 80 years ago, many of them came to China because of interest. Or because of some kind of romantic imagination about the Chinese culture or the social context. But now the motivation or the reason to come to China is more practical, because they can't find a permanent position in the European context or in the USA. So many of them choose to look at the Chinese academic market to find whether they can have a more stable working situation. And also, when we are talking about international scholars, they are not always from Western background or not always white, but that was the case 80 years ago. But now it's like more and more diverse, especially the international early career researchers from Pakistan, from African background are now like increasing very quickly. So we interviewed many scholars from like Middle East, from the African background. The reason why they came to China is because they have this kind of scholarship program. So it's kind of naturally they would get funded and they would get encouraged or introduced to come to China for the PhD study and then find a job here. So there are different pathways for them to come to China. So a very interesting trend, actually. Thank you.
Great. Any more?
Yeah, I probably can ask my question to Sarah.
Well, I did have one more question as well. Just
sure, thank you.
It was a clarification, really, because I think, am I right that your research has focused on Chinese universities rather than, say, Western universities who may have a campus in China?
Yeah.
And I wonder if your data has also shown anything around what impact their presence of kind of, a UK university having a campus in China, what impact that has on staff, more international staff taking up these positions.
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. That's very important issue to clarify. I didn't mention that. Thanks very much. I intend to pick up the Chinese universities as the focus of my research on purpose, because for the UK branch in China is more international, and I think more than 40% or 30% of the total staff are from the UK background or international background. So the atmosphere or institutional culture in that university would be very significantly different from the Chinese one. So for the Chinese university, I think in many cases, my participants would be the only one or one of the only two international scholars within the whole department. So they are like immersed in a kind of Chinese academia atmosphere. So that is very different. And actually one participant joining my research, he used to work in the kind of UK-China joint school, and later switch to the Chinese university. And there's a huge leap for him to address in this process. So that is very interesting that even though they are all in China, but the institutional culture is quite different. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really interesting. If there are no more questions for Jeju, then if Sarah, are you still there? I think there's a couple of questions for you.
I am, yes.
Great. Jeju, do you want to ask yours to Sarah first?
Yeah, I noticed there's one in the chat box, but I want to take this privilege to ask my question first. So I find your research very interesting for this kind of orientation program, because not many research has focused on this area. And you asked about the difference of understanding this issue from the psychologist perspective and the higher education perspective. So I just want to share a little bit about what I care a lot in your research, because I'm working on like a sociology of education. So I really want to know that if we are talking about orientation, what is what is value behind this all orientation program or orientation design? So like you also mentioned, this kind of integration, there should be a kind of dominant culture or dominant group within this campus context, so that we would call it orientation, that we would have it this kind of direction. So I really want to know that who decide this kind of value behind all of this program, and how different groups feel about this kind of value behind this kind of hidden curriculum, or when they are experiencing this orientation program, like the mature students you mentioned with carrying responsibility, or the in the context of widening participation, those students first in the family, how they feel about this orientation, and the international students mentioned by Josie, because they have very different backgrounds. There are a lot to cope with when you are introducing this orientation system. So yeah, that's kind of a thought, not really a question. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting too, because I was noticing too when you were talking about like the difference between the integration process and the assimilation process and the work that you're doing, because when it comes to things like Tinto and he's talking about integration, he's using the word, but he actually was meaning more that assimilation process, even though he wasn't coming out and saying it. And so yeah, it was really quite interesting listening to kind of the different breakdowns that you had of the impact for the researchers and the process that they went through to try and kind of and I guess it's the thing, right, to fit in, which is, as you said, you've got international students and students from traditionally underrepresented backgrounds. And that's where my interest in the sense of belonging and the psychological side, I think, comes in, because that whole idea of the social identity process, and the institution being a place where everyone belongs as themselves, and that sense of belonging as being the place where you are safe to be yourself, and and to be your true self. It is really kind of what I'm so interested in. And I've got that lovely balance between, I'm doing all the research, but I'm also running the team that does orientation at my institution. So I get to have that direct sort of influence as well, and be like, okay, well, we're not going to do this. We're going to do this instead because, and then, kind of get to make some of those changes along the way as well.
Thanks,
Sarah. That probably leads on to the question that was in the chat, and just if you could take a few moments just to explain how the method you plan to use to collect your data, given that you are in the thick of it.
Yeah, sure. So I'm actually getting close to the end of my PhD, submitting next year. So I've done all of my data collections at this point. I have a longitudinal survey that was undertaken with commencing students that followed them through a couple of years, to be able to try and understand their sense of belonging, how it changed over time, and what other things were impacting on them and what they were engaging with inside and outside the classroom. I also have institutional data, which, connects through again to the same sense of belonging, GPA, retention, and all of that fun stuff. And then rounded it all out with a whole bunch of interviews with students as well, to get their perception of that, what that experience was. Do they belong? What does belonging mean to them? To try and kind of, get that full understanding and ensure that student voice is included as well.
Brilliant. Thank you. We are now at time for this session, so thank you very much to everyone who has contributed to this. I've certainly learnt an awful lot. Really, really great to have the insight into, you know, both the student experience and the staff experience. I did put a little plug in the chat for any of you. If you are a newer researcher, that means you might be a PhD student, or you might be still in your early phases of doing higher education research. The network is meeting at 2 if you want to have an informal chat. And just thank you everyone for your contributions today. Got a short break now and then network sessions. So well done everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.